Hey everyone, hope you're doing well. So here's an extra video that I'm doing in order to show you guys how to make an input text box in Pygame. Because it's a useful thing to have, but Pygame doesn't have anything that does that directly. So we have to create something that does that ourselves. So I want to show you guys what it is that's going to be roughly what we're going to be making. So here is my example text box. And you can see that if I just click around, nothing really happens. But if I click on my text box, I get a little indicator here, and I can start writing stuff out. And then we could also have it so that we press enter, and then something happens. So I will show you how to do all of that, but I don't have it so that if I press enter, anything happens. But if we click elsewhere, we can see that the indicator disappears, meaning that we can't write anything anymore. So that's what we're going to be doing in this video. So, I already have some code here, just to get started. None of it is new. All of it comes from the breakout game that we've made already, so import statements are the same. I'm using game class, just like before. Got my constructor and a draw function. I defined the window size here rather than down in our main code. Doesn't really make too much difference, but I felt that it might be a nicer place to do it there. Initializing Pygame, creating the new game. I just call it window because it's more of a window than it is a game. Here is our listeners. So getting all the events. Right now the only event that we have is if they click the close button. Then we fill the window gray, we draw all the elements, and then we update. So nothing new here. But now comes the new part. We'll also call this the input box. Just like that. And so this is going to be our input box type thing that we're using in order to get text from the user. Say asking for their name or something. And so one thing we're going to want to define is what is the text that's going to be in that text box. We need to have some sort of string that the player is going to be able to write into. I also want to have a text size. I'm going to set it to 40 initially. I'm going to have its position, so its X position. I'm going to put it at 300. So our window is 800 by 600, so I'm going to have it just shifted over left by 100, so it's more or less centered. And also the length is going to be 200. So that will make it centered in the horizontal direction. In the Y direction, I want this thing to have a size of 50, so it'll be a little bit bigger than our text size, just so that we got a top and a bottom white space. Make it look a little bit nicer. So I'm going to put this at, say, 275, and the height is going to be 50. And then we'll have I'm going to have some offsets as well. So X offset is going to be 5, and Y offset will equal 5. I'm going to use these two offsets for just shifting the text so that it's better placed within our white box that we're going to be creating. So with all those made, we can define our constructor function. It's going to be taking in window as a parameter, just like all the other ones, because we need to know where is it that we're going to be drawing to. We need to create a new font. And so I'm going to do Arial again. This is going to be self.text size. Actually, maybe we'll set the font here too. That seems like a thing to do. Maybe we'll put it with the text size. So font equals Arial. So we'll have lowercase font, which is Arial, use it here, and then we're going to have uppercase font, which is going to be the font that we're actually using. Self-font. So we'll have to remember that these two are different, but this is the only place that we're using the lowercase version. That way we got all of our class parameters stuff all defined up here, so that if we want to change something, it's all in one spot. We're also going to make the rectangle that we're going to use for placing this thing. It's going to be a rectangle with our position at self.x, self.y, self.length, and self.width. There we go. So that is our rectangle that we're going to be using. We need to have a draw function. Define a draw function. Doesn't need to have any parameters. And it's going to draw two things initially. It's going to draw the white box that we're going to be putting our text in. So draw a rectangle. And we want to draw it on our window. We want it to be white. And we want it to be at the position defined by self.rectangle. Then we also need to do our text. And our text, we're going to be, once again, having some additional helper functions for making that. So I am going to copy and paste those old functions that we were using before. May as well reuse them. But I'm going to make a couple changes. Some of these actually already are changed, but I'm going to change it some more. In fact, I might even just have a place text function, because our position, we don't need to have any of this stuff in there. So we could get rid of that, because we have our position information is already up there. And we can combine these two since they do work together. And we don't need to give it the text color. I suppose we could. Maybe we'll actually make another variable here. Text color is black, of course. But if we want to change it, that's where we can change it. And so how about we just do a place text function. So let's grab this, throw it in here. And we'll make the text inside of our place text function rather than have two different functions. It was useful to have two different functions for other example, because we were placing different texts in different places, and we wanted to make sure that we could reuse those functions for whatever we wanted to do. This is only going to be responsible for drawing one thing, so it doesn't need to have that kind of flexibility that our other code had. So, we'll just call this the font here. So create that font. We want to use the self.text, and we want to use self.textcolor. So that way we don't need to pass it any information about the text color. We don't need to even pass it information about really anything, because it's using all of these class parameters rather than having to construct things individually. And background color is white. Good. And actually we'll call this the text, and this will be text. So this is not self.text, this is the text that's being created here. And that should be pretty good. We do need to give it a new rectangle for where this thing's going to go, though. Actually, so we'll call this the background rectangle. And we'll also make the text rectangle, since they're going to be in slightly different places. And so I can actually use this. it's going to be at self.x minus, or plus, sorry, because we're going to the right, plus self.x offset, self.y plus self.y offset. And I'm actually going to split these across a couple lines, just to make it a little bit easier to read. Self.length looks good. We can probably keep it the same. Actually, we'll need to minus self.x offset here, because we won't be able to go quite as far. And self.width, we cannot go down that far. We need to actually subtract self.y offset, actually times 2, both of these, because we need to offset it on both sides. That's basically what it's doing. So the width is going to be not just cut off on the left, it's cut off on the right. So that's why we got the times 2 here for the length. It's not going to be quite as long. And then its height is also going to be cut down by twice the offset. So that's why the times 2 are there. Yep. That looks pretty good. And then here we're going to need to tell it what rectangle to do. We want to use the text rectangle here. And we want to use the background rectangle here. Background rect. That should be pretty good now. So, then we can just call the place text function. Right there. And now, if we can create our text box here, so self.input box is equal to input box. Need to give it the window so it knows where to draw the thing. And here, now we can draw our input box. Beauty. Alright, so if this is all working, if we run this thing, we should now get a white square on a gray background. Oh. Constructor function. Where did I say it was? Line 10. Oh. Right here. Game init self.input box equals. Take 0 positional arguments. Actually, it takes 2 positional arguments. What is it doing? Oh, whoopsie. This is supposed to be a class, not a function. Whoopsies. There we go. Oh, self dot. Oh, I used height. Length. And height. Did I do that anywhere else? Yes, I did. Height. And that should be good now. There we go. So after fixing a couple bugs, things I forgot, now we got our text box. And so that's going to be where we are going to be putting our text. So now that we got the thing drawn, let's get to the point that we can actually put text in there, right? So we're going to be making a new function that's going to be taking care of all that stuff. I'm going to call it the update text function. Maybe, or we could just call it update, I guess. But update looks good. This is going to need to actually have one thing passed to it, and what it is going to be an event. Actually, it's going to be this event object. So it says for event in event.get. So it's getting a bunch of events, and all these events corresponds to button pushes on the keyboard or mouse clicks and stuff like that. And so that is what we're passing here. And we're going to use that event in order to determine what we want to do. So we need to check for a couple things. We're going to be first checking, did they hit the enter key? If they hit the enter key, then we're going to want to do something with that text, like assign it to their name or something. And so this is going to be where we would put the code after the person is done putting in their text and they hit enter in order to say, okay, here, use this as your input. So what we do is we take our event that we just passed it, and we're going to get the key. So we're only going to be updating this when there's a button push. That's not going to do any of the mouse stuff. So we know that there's going to be a key being pushed, and we want to know whether or not it's equal to the return key or the enter key. And if it is, this is going to be where you would put your code of what you want to do when they hit enter at the end of putting in text. Alright? So our code is not going to do anything. This really depends on what you want to use your text box for. We also need to have something that checks to see if they hit backspace, because we need to allow them to hit backspace and erase text as well in case they make mistakes. So elif event.key equals k underscore backspace. And if it is, then what we're going to do is we're just going to remove the last character in our text string. So self.text is going to equal self.text, but everything from the beginning to the last character. And remember that it goes up to but not including this. So that means that it's not going to include the last character. And that is basically how you can have it so that it erases the last character. Finally, else. So if it's anything else other than enter or backspace, what we're going to do is we are going to add the letter corresponding to that place. What button they push. So we're going to add to our text, and what we're going to add is from our event, we're going to add the Unicode of that key, which is basically a way of saying that letter. So that is our update function, and what we want to do now is we need to have it so that this thing will now get input in this section here from our events. So always want to have the quit first. So we're going to elif. And what do we want to check? We want to check whether or not this is a key down event. Whether or not did they push something on the keyboard. So elif event dot type, which will tell us what type of event this is, and we want to know if this is a key down event. And if it is, then we're going to call our update function, passing it the event so it can handle it and add the text to what we want to do. So I'm going to do self dot, or not self dot, we're not inside of a class, so window. And our other thing we'd call it game, but I called it window here. Just wanted to call it something that was descriptive of what it was. We want to get the input box. And we want to call the update function, passing it the event. And that should have it so that now we can write into that. So let's see if that even works. So, look at that. Oh, we're getting a little bit of white down at the bottom. I think I'm going to want to change the offset, the Y offset up a little bit. So, hello world. Yay. Yep, looks good. So, that's all fine and good, but it also is always going to write regardless of whether or not it's active. That's another thing that we have about text boxes is they're not always active. Normally we have to click on them to activate them, and then we can click on them, write into them. And if we click off of them, then they're deactivated and we can't write into them anymore. So we want to have that functionality as well. So let's fix that offset. Let's change that to maybe like 3. See if that looks a little bit nicer. Yeah, that looks pretty good. And what we're going to do is we're going to add another class parameter. We're going to call it active. And it's going to start off as false. Or flash. And we are going to need to make a couple more functions. They're going to be nice, quick, easy functions that will either select or deselect the text box. So we're going to have a function called select, and it's going to do self dot active equals true, and then we're going to have another function called deselect, and this is going to set self dot active to false. Oops. There we go. So these are known as sort of setter functions, sort of. You'll see a lot more of these if you work in Java, where you don't actually work with the class parameters directly. Instead, you make functions that will handle changing the different values of the class parameters or even accessing them. But it makes this a little bit easier. So, what we want to do is we want to only update if this thing is active. So, we're going to change this. Actually, we can keep it like that. So, if not active, not self.active, if this thing is not active, whoops, get rid of the Y, then we don't want to do anything, so we're just going to return. It's always nice that if you want your function to not actually run under certain conditions, put that condition first so that you exit the function immediately rather than run through the entire thing only to find out you didn't need to do anything. So if it's not active, then we're not going to do anything, otherwise we're going to do this stuff. And now we need to have something that will update for whether or not we are clicking on the button or not. So we want to actually do one thing. We want to have our function that's going to check whether or not we click on something, is that being clicked on in the box. So I'm going to make kind of a new function called here, called, is it input box, which is going to be a boolean. And you're asking, okay, why aren't you defining it? This is a new function, right? Well, actually, we already have this function. Pygame already makes it for us, but it's kind of buried inside of our input box. It's attached to this background rectangle. It's one of those functions, rectangle functions. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give that function a much nicer name. So I'm going to call it an input box, which is just going to check whether or not that point is in an input box. But the function that it is from the window, get its input box. Then we need to get the input box's rectangle, and from that, actually we need the background rectangle, because that's going to be the one that we're checking, and then we want to know whether or not it collides with a point. Kind of like how we did it with the collision between the different objects in our breakout game. We used collide rect in order to find out whether or not two rectangles were colliding. Here we use collide point to find out if this rectangle is colliding with a particular point, and we're going to get that point from our event here. It will tell us where a mouse click occurred. Notice I don't have any brackets there. The brackets at the end say call this function, but I can actually just take the function itself, not add anything at the end, and this is now sort of a function variable, which I'm going to assign to input box here. Kind of like what we did for the mode. We said, okay, mode equals int, and then we could call that function like that. We're going to do the same thing here. So that's what's going on. We're taking some big long function, we're assigning it a new name, and then we can call it by its new name. And so inside of our event loop here, we now need to also check whether or not it's a mouse down button. So elif event dot type, and we want to know if this is a mouse button down type. And if it is, we now need to know, okay, where are they clicking? This tells us, okay, they're clicking somewhere. We need to know where they're clicking. Are they inside of our, clicking inside of our text box? In that case, we need to activate it. If they're clicking outside the text box, then we need to deactivate it. So we'll put a nested if statement in here. I'm going to say if in text box or in input box. So calling that function, and we're going to give it the position of where they clicked, which is event dot position. So did they click inside the box? In that case, we are going to select that box. So window dot input box dot select. And if it's not inside, else, then window dot input box dot deselect. There we go. So now we should be able to activate or deactivate it by clicking in or out of the text box. So let's try this again. Test it out, make sure that there's no bugs. So I'm going to click outside, and I'm going to start writing, and nothing's happening. I'm going to click inside. Uh-oh, nothing's happening. Alright. So, what if I set this to true initially? Can I write in it? I want to know whether or not... Yeah, so if I set it to true, I can write in it. So that's not a problem. Set back to false. Separate that. Oh, whoopsies. Those are supposed to be single, not double. There we go. So outside, looks good. Click on it, and now I can write in. I click outside, and I can't write in anymore. So that's pretty good. And that would now be a pretty effective text box, but I want to do one more thing before we finish off with this video, and that is I want to put that sort of cursor thing to indicate that the text box is active or not. So, what we need to do is we need to have some code that will insert that cursor if it's active and remove it if it's not active. So right here, when we're activating it, we need to first check, is there a reason for us to add this cursor? Because the cursor might already be there. If it's already there, then we need to make sure that we don't add it. Otherwise, we'll have some issues. So we'll make an if statement to check first, is the length of our text equal to 0? Because if that's true, then we definitely need to add it because we don't have any text in there at all. Or if self.text, the last element is not, if the last element is not equal to, and I'm going to use that as our cursor. So this character right here is not actually letter I, it is shift backspace, or shift backslash. So that is where that one comes from, right above enter. And so if either of those are true, either the text has nothing in it, or the last thing in the text is not this, then we're going to add that character to the end. Self.text plus equals that. Perfect. So it activates it, and then it checks to see whether or not it needs to add one. Because if we clicked it on a whole bunch of times, we could activate it a bunch of times, but we don't want to keep on adding more of those. So just to check to see if we need to add one, and we'll do the same thing here, but we need to know, okay, first if the length of the self.text is not equal to 0, or if self.text, or actually and, sorry, and I'm missing a bracket, and self.text, the last character, is equal to that indicator. And if it is, then we need to remove it. So self.text equals self.text from the beginning to the last element. So that will remove that last element, or last character. This part is important because if we don't check for these and we just try to do this, then we can get an error if we're trying to refer to something that's not actually there. So if we try to refer to the last thing in a string and the string is empty, that would give us an error. Same thing here. If we tried to access the last thing in it and it was empty, once again give us an error. So that is why we're doing it this way. First checking, make sure that we don't have a problem with it being a 0, an empty string, and then check the other condition as well. So that will activate or deactivate, but we need to do some more work in our update function here. Because if we just have that and then they start typing and writing stuff in, this is not going to be at the end of our string anymore. So we need to make sure that when we're adding stuff here, or removing stuff, we're removing the thing that we're supposed to be removing. So, we need to modify the backspace part, because we need to not just remove the last thing, we need to remove the last two things. Because when this thing is active, the last thing is that indicator. So we need to remove the last two things, then add our indicator back. And that will be how we delete the last character that they entered in, rather than this special character there. Here, we're going to do kind of the same thing. We're going to remove this character from the end. So, we kind of just do this, but only remove the last one. Then we're going to add the letter, and then we're going to add that character back. Like that. So that will now correctly update our text so that it doesn't accidentally put in a whole bunch of these or remove what it's not supposed to. And that should be everything that we need to do. So let's try running this thing one more time. Oh. Why is that invalid? Oh. Whoopsie, that's supposed to be a colon. Not a comma. Did I do that anywhere else? I don't think I did. Nope. Alright, so it's not active. I click on it. Now you can see that my indicator showed up. And I'm going to do hello world. And you can see that it moved with it, but the indicator is still there. If I click off of it, indicator disappears, indicating that it's not active. If I write, nothing happens. If I can click back on it, I can hit backspace and it deletes everything, but the indicator still stays at the end. Woo. Success! Beauty! So there we go. We have our text box that we can use inside of Pygame. So, just to go over everything that we did. So this part was exactly the same as from our game. Here we have an active flag that tells whether or not we want that text box to be open, as well as what is the text that's inside of it currently. We created a whole bunch of parameters that would make sure all the spacing, position, spacing, colors, etc. were all good. So if you want to change those, you can do them there. We got our constructor function, which will create our font that we're going to use, as well as two rectangles, one for where we're going to draw the white background of our text box, and then another one for where we're placing the text itself. And then we got our draw function, which we simplified by putting our place text and make text into one function. Made sense to do it here because we're only going to be dealing with one text. Unlike our other example, when we're placing multiple different things, it was useful to have those different functions in order to facilitate that. Our update function is going to be passed an event, which is always going to be a key down event, because that is what we check for down here. If event key down, then we pass that event to our update function. And this update function first checks, okay, is this even active? If it's not, then don't bother doing anything. Then we check to see what it is that they're pushing down. If they hit the enter key or the return key, this is going to be where you put your code of what you want to do when they hit enter. Alright? So, can't tell you what to put here because that totally depends on what your program is doing. Backspace, this is for if they wanted to delete something. So now this is how we delete stuff. And if it's anything else, then we remove that indicator, add the Unicode character for that key that they entered in, and then put the end indicator back. Select function will make the text box active, as well as ensure that the end indicator is there. And deselect will deactivate the window and remove that end indicator. So, we also saw how we can actually assign a function to another variable. So this is a function that I didn't want to write out the entire time, way down here, right there. So I assigned it to something that was a little bit more descriptive, just saying if input box. And so it checks to see whether or not the player clicked inside of the background rectangle input box. And depending on if they did or did not, the input box gets selected or deselected. Finally, we check to see if it's a key down, and if it is, then we pass it to our input box to handle whether or not we're putting in characters or not. And then the last stuff is exactly what from the game before. So that is what I wanted to show you guys for this video. I will see you guys next time. But yeah, I hope that you guys find this useful for whatever it is that you want to make in Pygame. Alright, have a good one, and I'll see you next time.